As we've said before, we can all understand how the Ayatollah Khomeini or Saddam Hussein could be a leader of some religion in a foreign country, and we all are amazed at how many people, how many millions of people will follow such a man or follow such a religion. And we just attribute it to just mass hypnosis or mass lunacy. It's just incredible how those people follow their leaders in the Middle East or in China or somewhere else in the world. But we never apply that to ourselves. We have the same kind of blind obeisance given to creeds which are just not true, based on fantasies, based on lies, misperceptions, and yet we will fight to the death to defend our beliefs, because of course the concept is that we have two parties here. We have the opposing team, they are always bad, and then there's our team, our boys, and they're always good. So anything we believe is the truth. Anything they believe is foolishness. When we talk about the Old Testament, a classic example of this is how much we really don't understand the God of the Bible. When we're reading the Old Testament, we have to keep in mind that there were three separate gods in the Old Testament. Now, happily, the Christians are not aware of that, because Christians are not very well aware of the old or the ancient Semitic system of things. In the Bible, Moses is referred to as warning against the astrologers and those who read the future by the stars. And Christians will point to that and say, well, see, now there is astrology. And so God said to have nothing to do with astrology, reading the stars, because that's evil. Well, actually, if you do your homework, which most Christians haven't, but if you do your homework, you're going to find out that there were three separate gods in the Old Testament. Three distinct and different gods being worshipped in the Old Testament. The first one was the stellar cult. The stellar cult worshipped the stars and connected themselves with God through the study of the stars. The stellar cult, a Semitic cult, whose God was in the stars. Then there was the lunar cult, or the cult that worshipped God through the moon. And that's, of course, where the Hebrews come from. Their lineage is out of the lunar cult, or the Ptolemaic lunar cult, of which Moses was said to be the leader. And that's why, of course, in Hebrew, the days were always counted after sundown, because that's when the lunar god came out. The moon came up after sundown. And then, of course, there was Saturn, or the old Ugaritic god El. Saturn was infiltrated in the later days and becomes known as El, which is where we get Isis, Ra-El, I-S-R-A-E-L. Israel, that's Isis, Re, El, the Ugaritic god. Saturn. In order to understand the Old Testament and the New Testament, you have to first understand where the book comes from, who wrote it. You have to understand it in the context of the time in which it was written. I'm going to make a statement now that many people who are in denial will not want to hear, but if you give me an opportunity, I think I can prove the point. The Bible is nothing more, Old and New Testament, nothing more than a retelling of the most ancient story the world has ever known. And that's why the Bible's called the greatest story ever told. Not the greatest collection of facts, the greatest story ever told. And a cursory understanding of ancient history will show that the greatest story ever told was the story of the zodiac. Astrology. The Bible is nothing more than the greatest astrological astronomical story ever told. It is pure astrology based on the zodiac. No one's ever told you that before. No one would ever tell you such a thing. But the fact of the matter is, if you've done your homework, you're going to find that the Bible is nothing more than astrotheology, the worship of God's heaven. Christians today even believe that when they die, they're going to heaven with God's Son. Let me give you an example of how astrology permeates the Old Testament. Now, as I said, those who would not want to hear this are in denial. But as a teacher, I'm asking only to hear what I have to say. In the book of John, in the New Testament, John 14:2, Jesus said, "In my Father's house are many mansions." Well, like many other scriptures in the King James, that was not correctly translated. In fact, it is not "in my Father's house are many mansions," because in fact that makes very little to no sense at all. How can you have houses or mansions in a house? "In my Father's house are many mansions" is correctly translated, "In my Father's abode are many dwelling places. In my Father's heavens are many houses." Well, of course, there's at least 12 houses in the heavens that we know of. In my Father's abode, the heavens, there are many houses. That's right, at least 12 houses of the zodiac. That's what was being said here. Now we go to perhaps the oldest book in the Bible, Job. And in the book of Job, I ask you to turn to chapter 38 and read with me, if you can, where in 38, 31, 32, and 33, something very important is said concerning astrology. In chapter 38, 33, first, the scripture says, "Knowest thou the ordinances of heaven?" In other words, there are ordinances in heaven. And 31 now, going back to 38, 31, God says to Job, according to the scripture, "Can thou bind the sweet influences of the Pleiades or loose the bands of Orion?" What are we talking about here? The Pleiades, an astrological symbol in the zodiac. And God is supposedly saying to Job, "Can thou bind the sweet influences?" What influences? I thought that that's all evil. That's all astrology. That's that New Age stuff. We don't have anything to do with that. And here God is saying to his prophet Job, "Can thou bind the sweet influences of the Pleiades or loose the bands of Orion? Can thou bring forth Mazzaroth in his season?" Now there's a heavy piece of information. God is saying to Job in 32, 38, 32, "Can thou bring forth Mazzaroth in his season? Or can thou guide Arcturus with his sons?" We're talking astrology here. Now, if you go to the King James Version, that's the version that God spoke. And if we read from the King James Bible what the word Mazzaroth means. Here in the King James, in the interpreting dictionary, in the back of the King James, we look up the word Mazzaroth. And here we see Mazzaroth means the 12 signs of the zodiac. That's from the King James. Mazzaroth means the zodiac. And therefore God is saying to his great prophet Job, "Can thou bring forth the zodiac in his season?" That's right, because the zodiac has 12 seasons, 12 houses, and that's why God's Son, the light of the world, could say, "In my Father's abode are many houses." We're talking astrology here. But I'm going to tell you one of the most interesting things you're going to find in the Bible about astrology is the end times. There's not a Christian program on anywhere that is not concerned with the end times, the